I'm Scot Bayless. Been a game guy for, this is scary, almost 40 years. Actually started making games for serious in 1986, give or take. And I never thought that was going to be my career path at all. When I left high school, went into college, I was an art and theater major. And I actually stumbled into computers, which at the time really weren't used for games at all. In fact, that was about the same time that Nolan Bushnell was just getting started putting Pong into, you know, pool halls and pizza joints and stuff like that. So, the game business didn't really exist. But I was passing through the computer center at my college. I saw this guy making stuff on a graphics terminal that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before in my life. And I'm like, I have to find out what that is and what this guy's doing. And I went in and talked to him, and it turned out he was the head of the department. He said, well, if you want to know how to do this, why don't you take my CS 101 class and you'll find out. And I said, well, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So I dropped the class that I was going to and took his class instead. And about a month later, I'm sitting at that same terminal, and it's like 9 o'clock at night. And I've got books on the floor and books in my lap, and I'm hammering away at the terminal, and I'm actually making a game. And the department head walks up and he says, look, I have to go home. We got to close the center down. So you need to stop. And by the way, stop coming to my class. And I'm like, why? And he said, because you've already gone way past everything we're going to study this semester. Just turn in everything you do at the end of the semester. I'll give you an A. And he did. But that started me down this road because I discovered that computers were the best tool I could find for making things that you could play. And that's what set me off on the path that took me to where I am now. I spent a bunch of time working in the aerospace and defense industry as a computer guy. Mostly working on things that were in some way simulations. So if, for example, you've ever heard of a system called Miles, it may ring a bell for a few people. It was actually the original laser tag. And the Army invented it as a way of teaching soldiers how to do what they do. And I worked on that, and that scratched the itch a little harder and got me a little more excited about what I could do with technology for entertainment. And eventually, I found myself in a position where I was doing that kind of stuff for a living. And a friend who had been working in QA for a game company, and this was in the mid 1980s. We were hanging out one day, and he said, "Hey, do you want to make a game?" And I'm like, "Well, sure. What does that mean?" He said, "Well, we just lost our programmer for this Dungeons and Dragons game we're working on, and yeah, you should go talk to the guys and see if maybe you could get involved." So I did, and after a couple of conversations, they said, "Well, yeah, we'd like to hire you, bring you on as the lead developer for the PC version of what became Pool of Radiance, which was the first real Dungeons and Dragons computer RPG in 1987 or whatever it was." And I said yes, and I took a 50% pay cut and never looked back. It was the best decision I've ever made. The industry at that time was kind of like the Wild West. It was just people making stuff up because nobody really knew what the game industry was. There were a few companies that were starting to publish games. Atari was making their console and doing pretty well with that. This was a time when you could make a game with 2 or 3 people. And we, idiots that we were trying to make a game with like 40 people. And so we were doing AAA work and didn't even really know what that was. But we did it. We got it done. And the rest was history. From there, I stayed as a technical guy for a few years. And then because I was always attracted to the design side, started looking for opportunities that were more about producing or design. And that led me into the world of uh, simulations because I'd done stuff that was kind of like that when I was working in the defense industry, and I signed up to work on a game that was called Falcon 3, which was at the time the most ambitious flight simulator ever made. We built it, and we actually made a, believe it or not, this was in the like 1990. We actually made a VR version of the game, and we went and found a couple of Air National Guard F-16 pilots and asked them to come in and test our VR simulator. One of the pilots came in, showed up in the office, and we sat him down in this chair and we stuck this big headset on his head because this is 1990. The technology was not nearly as refined as it is now. He put the thing on and he started flying the simulator, and he said, "This is awesome. Uh-oh." And he ripped the headset off of his head, turned and barfed in a garbage can. Because in those days, frame lag wasn't something we really understood that well. And so he got seasick almost instantaneously. But you know what? It was really cool and it was really fun. And in fact, he got so excited about it, we ended up going to General Dynamics and demoing the simulator for those guys. Because at the time they were building F-16s, and they were building these big, expensive, multi-million-dollar simulators to train pilots. And they looked at our simulator, and the guy that was the head of the simulator project at General Dynamics was like, "You know what? Your sim is actually better than ours. Can we just borrow some of your stuff?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure, I guess." And so they actually incorporated some of our techniques and some of our code into their big, expensive simulator. At that point, I found myself getting really sucked in to the world of creative. The game business was beginning to start drifting in the direction of being a little bit more grown up about how they approached the creative. It wasn't just blowing stuff up, and it wasn't just fighting. There were other things that were starting to kind of sneak into the offering, and I was really excited about that. So I spent a few years at Sega, and worked both as a technical guy and also as a producer and a creative, and then went off to help found the studio, a studio that ultimately became part of Sony and is still part of Sony today. That studio evolved into the studio that's making Days Gone, and I went off to ultimately join Microsoft and help get Xbox into the world, which was really a fun project because we were like these crazy people at Microsoft. I mean, you have to remember, this is at a time at Microsoft when literally nobody in the executive layer at Microsoft believed that games were even really a thing. For them, it was all about operating systems and the desktop. And we're like, no, 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 we're going to do this thing, and people are going to love it. And they came within a hair's breadth of saying no. And in fact, at one point, they were actually talking to Nintendo about possibly just teaming up with Nintendo to do whatever it is we wanted to do. And ultimately, they relented, and they allowed us to just go make Xbox, and off we went. So, for me, the interesting part of that whole journey basically boils down to the fact that I never expected to pursue games as a career. I was always interested in games. I always loved playing games. I actually, way back in the day, I used to spend a lot of time designing paper games. And in fact, I even did a couple of little projects for a small game publishing company in Texas back in the late 70s. It was always the thing I was attracted to, but I never thought I could actually go do it for a living. And it turns out I'm not unique. There's a huge number of people that I know in the business who kind of fell into it. And I don't mean they got lucky. It's they realized that what they knew how to do actually had value in the biz. And I'll tell you, some of the people I know in the biz who are some of the best people I've ever worked with came out of jobs that really had nothing to do with games. It's not as if you have to set out from day one saying to yourself, I don't know, in high school, I'm going to go be a game designer and I'm going to follow this academic path to get me into games. That's not really how it works. You have to learn how to do the work. You have to be capable of doing it in a professional way. But the personal skills, the life skills that will help you do that well sometimes come from really weird places. The best producer I ever worked with was a bartender for 5 years. Well, why did that help him? Because he was really good at talking to people and he was really good at telling stories. And that turns out to be a valuable skill when you're a producer. That happens all the time. So for me, the message turned out to be if it's a thing you want to do that you're excited about and you can learn to be really good at something that kind of overlaps the work that gets done in the business, there's a fairly high probability you're going to find somebody who wants you to do that work. But you have to learn how to do it well. And that's really what it comes down to. I think if I was going to give anybody advice about how to get into the biz, it would be get really good at something. And it almost doesn't matter what that is. It could be psychology. It could be painting. It could be math. It could be writing stories. It almost doesn't matter because the entertainment business is so broad and so diverse. Virtually every skill you can think of has some kind of place in the ecosystem. The question is, are you that good? And are you willing to be that professional? So what does a game designer do? This is interesting because it's not what you think, almost certainly. So my experience as a game designer boils down to kind of two things. Breaking problems apart. And what I mean by that is I want to do a thing. I want to make a character do a certain group of things in the game. So, well, how am I going to do that? Well, there's a bunch of stuff going on at the same time that you need to think through in order to answer that question. How are they moving? Why are they doing that? What will happen if they encounter something? What will that change about how they behave? There's like this explosion of questions that comes out of, I want to make the character do a thing. And so one of the things game designers do a lot is make lists. Well, why do you make lists? Because making a list helps you think about the thing you're trying to break apart. It breaks it into little chunks, and you can organize those little chunks in a way that makes you go, oh, I see. Here's the stuff he's doing, and this thing I was thinking about doesn't really matter anymore because it's not really relevant to the rest of this stuff. And all of this stuff in this list actually implies this other list, which is things like animations and sound effects and all this other junk that kind of emerges from the thing you're trying to design. So lists turn out to be really valuable things for a game designer. The other thing I learned about game design that I didn't see coming is you never stop thinking about it. I've done a fair amount of writing in my career, both inside the business and outside the business. When you're working on a project, and every writer I know will tell you the same thing, you think about it all the time. I mean, you literally never stop processing. You'll dream about it. You'll wake up thinking about it. You'll spend the morning thinking about it while you're drinking your coffee and eating your bacon and eggs or whatever the hell it is you're doing. It's a constant immersion in the process. And I think that's part of what it means to be a designer. And then there's this other thing that designers do that boils down to try it and see. And you hear people talking about agile development a lot, and that's been fashionable for a couple of decades now. Game designers in general, I think, but certainly game designers, are constantly in that try it and see mode. And that may involve building something and testing it against your assumptions and playing around with it and seeing if it does what you think it's going to do, or whether a certain activity is fun, or whatever it is you're trying to nail down. But you do that all the time. And it used to be way back in the day that in order to do that, you needed other people, unless you were a coder yourself. And I was, so I could sometimes do this stuff on my own. Quite often, you would need other people to sort of build the thing you had in mind and get them to help you test it out. Nowadays, a lot of designers just do it themselves. They build it, they try it, they tweak it, they change it, they rip stuff out, they put stuff in, and that process is part of what being a designer is. And then finally, and this is probably going to sound stupid, but it really is true. Designers spend an enormous amount of their time talking to people all the time, almost every day. When I was working on Everything or Nothing at Electronic Arts, I had 4 designers on the design team and a creative director. They literally spent half their time walking around talking to people on the team. Well, why did they do that? Well, a couple of reasons. First, you got to get people to believe, right? You have this really spiffy idea. Oh, this is going to be so awesome if we do this in the game. Yeah, but now you got to convince like 12 people that makes sense, because they're going to make the character models, they're going to make the props, they're going to make the sound effects, they're going to make the animations, they're going to code the behaviors. All of those people have to be on board. And if you just throw it over the wall and say, well, yeah, do this, they're going to look at you like, well, why? You have to convince them that it's a good idea, and then you have to explain it. And you can write it down, or you can talk to them. And you'll probably do both, but the talking to them part is actually much more effective. So in a team, at least, designers spend a lot of their time just getting people on board and making sure they understand. Now, you would think that's a producer's job. It's not really. Designers are the ones who actually do that. And in a lot of ways, designers do kind of live at the hub of a project. And I don't mean that to sound like designers are the arbiters of the project's success, because that's not really true. But what designers do touches everybody. And that's pretty cool, because you get to have a lot of fun talking to a lot of people about a lot of interesting things and solving problems along the way. But it's kind of a big responsibility, because if you don't do that effectively, then everybody's kind of confused. They don't really know what to make. They don't really know how to make it. They don't really know what it's supposed to do when it's done. That's a problem. And we've all heard stories about projects that went off the rails. Every one that I've seen that went off the rails, that was part of the problem. The designers weren't really successful in talking to people. So the day of a designer, half the time you're munching your Cheerios and thinking really hard and making lists in your head, and the other half of the time you're talking to people trying to explain what the hell it is you're up to. It's actually a pretty cool job.